You wake up, you go to work, you earn money. And before you even see your paycheck, a piece is already gone. Income tax, payroll tax, sales tax when you spend it, property tax if you own anything, inflation quietly eroding what's left. And you probably think this is just how economies work. Everyone pays taxes, everyone deals with inflation. It's normal. But let me show you what's actually happening. Every single one of those mechanisms, taxation, inflation, interest on debt, they're not separate systems. They're pieces of one continuous apparatus, a wealth extraction machine. And it was built deliberately over centuries by people who understood exactly what they were creating. This isn't about corruption or bad politicians. This is structural. The machine runs automatically. It pulls value from your labor, from your savings, from your future, and channels it upward to a small network of creditors, bondholders, and institutions that own the debt your government can never repay. And the design is so elegant that most people never see it working. They just feel poorer every year and can't figure out why. Here's the simple truth behind the entire system. When your government borrows money, it promises to pay interest forever. That interest comes from taxes, your taxes. So every dollar of government debt creates a permanent stream of payments flowing from ordinary workers to whoever holds the bonds. And those bondholders? They're not random. They're banks, asset management firms, pension funds controlled by financial elites, and foreign governments. The machine was designed so that you, the worker, the taxpayer, the saver, are locked into a system where you pay continuously and they collect continuously. And here's the part that should terrify you. The debt can never be paid off. Not because governments are irresponsible, but because the money supply itself is created through debt. If the debt disappeared, the money would disappear. The economy would collapse. So the system requires permanent debt, which means permanent interest payments, which means you pay forever. Let me show you 5 moments in history when this machine was built, how each piece was installed, and why escape is now impossible. Before the late 1600s, governments borrowed the way individuals did. A king needed money for war or a palace. He'd approach a wealthy merchant or noble, borrow a sum, promise repayment with interest. If he paid it back, creditors were happy. If he didn't, they lost their money. Either way, the debt eventually cleared. It was temporary. Risky for lenders, sometimes disastrous for kings, but finite. Then, in 1694, something changed in England. The country was broke. War with France was draining the treasury. Tax revenue couldn't cover costs. Traditional lenders were refusing new loans because English kings had defaulted before. The government was desperate. A Scottish merchant named William Paterson saw an opportunity. He gathered a group of wealthy London merchants and made them an offer they couldn't refuse. They would lend the English government £1.2 million, an enormous sum, roughly 300 million in modern value. But here's the innovation that changed everything. The government wouldn't pay it back, ever. Instead, it would pay 8% interest annually, forever. The loan would be permanent. Why would anyone accept this? Because the interest payment was guaranteed by Parliament. It was backed not by the King's word. As long as England could collect taxes, the interest would flow. And the lenders would receive tradable notes from a new institution Paterson proposed creating, the Bank of England. Parliament approved it. The Bank of England was chartered in 1694. The merchants handed over their gold. The government got its war funding. And for the first time in history, national debt became a permanent feature of the state. Not a problem to solve, a design feature. Here's why this mattered. The government paid £96,000 per year in interest on that 1.2 million. Every year, forever. The merchants had essentially purchased an annuity backed by the entire tax base of England. As long as the country existed, as long as it could extract taxes from its people, the money flowed to them. And if they wanted liquidity, they could sell their Bank of England notes to someone else. The debt was transferable but never extinguishable. But Paterson's real genius was what came next. The Bank of England was authorized to issue paper currency backed by the government's debt. They could create money up to the value of the loan. This meant the government's IOU, its promise to pay, became money itself. The more the government borrowed, the more currency could be created. Think about what this creates. Government debt is no longer a burden to be eliminated. It's the foundation of the money supply. The debt becomes money, and money requires debt. You can't have one without the other. This is the first piece of the extraction machine. The government borrows perpetually. It pays interest perpetually from taxes, And the debt itself circulates as currency. The taxpayer is now locked in. You're not just funding government operations, you're funding permanent interest payments to private creditors, and those payments never stop. Within 50 years, every major European power copied the model. France established similar systems. The Dutch formalized perpetual bonds, and by 1790, the newly independent United States, led by Alexander Hamilton, adopted the same structure. Hamilton explicitly modeled the American financial system on the Bank of England. Permanent debt, interest paid from taxation, bonds traded as currency. Paterson died in 1719, but the machine he built still runs. The Bank of England still exists. British government debt has never been paid off. It's been refinanced, rolled over, expanded, but never eliminated. The debt trap was set in 1694, and every government since has walked into it willingly. Because once you build your money supply on top of debt, you can't escape without destroying the currency itself. By the early 1800s, European governments had embraced permanent debt. They borrowed for wars, infrastructure, colonial expansion. But the market was still primitive. Each loan was negotiated individually. Interest rates fluctuated wildly. Only the wealthiest individuals could participate. There was no organized system. Then the Rothschild family industrialized it. The Rothschilds started as traders and money changers in Frankfurt. By 1800, 5 brothers had established banks in 5 European capitals: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. This network gave them something unprecedented: the ability to move money across borders faster than anyone else, faster than governments, faster than armies. They used this speed to dominate sovereign debt. Nathan Rothschild, operating out of London, was the strategic architect. He arranged loans for the British government. But his innovation wasn't just lending, it was creating a secondary market. Here's how it worked. The British government needed cash immediately. Nathan would provide it by purchasing government bonds at a discount. Then he would resell those bonds to investors across Europe at a markup. Pension funds, insurance companies, aristocrats, other banks. The government got fast money. Rothschild pocketed the spread, and investors got a tradable asset that paid interest. But Nathan did something else. He made sure governments had no choice but to use him. In 1815, Nathan famously received news of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo a full day before official channels. His courier network was faster than the British government's. He used that information to manipulate the bond market. First, he sold British bonds publicly, signaling that Britain was losing. Prices collapsed. Other investors panicked and sold. Then quietly, after prices hit bottom, Rothschild bought massive quantities at rock-bottom rates. When official news of British victory arrived the next day, bond prices surged. Nathan made millions, not from luck, but from controlling information and market access. This established the Rothschild model: control the information, control the issuance, control the distribution. By 1820, the Rothschilds were the dominant underwriters of European sovereign debt. If a government needed to borrow, it went through them. Because they controlled the investor network, they had the relationships, they set the terms. Here's why this is the second piece of the extraction machine. Before Rothschild, if a king defaulted, his creditors lost money and the system reset. The debt cleared. But Rothschild made sovereign debt internationally tradable and interconnected. A British bond might be owned by a French investor who sold it to a Prussian bank who pledged it as collateral for a loan to a Viennese merchant. The web of ownership became so tangled that defaulting was no longer just stiffing one lender. It meant collapsing an entire international financial network. Default became systemically impossible. Governments were trapped. They had to keep paying, and if they couldn't pay from tax revenue, they had to borrow more to cover the interest on old debts. This is when the debt trap stopped being just permanent and became inescapable. Rothschild didn't just lend money. He structured the system so that nations had no exit. They were bound by the threat of systemic collapse. And the Rothschilds collected interest on it all. By the mid-1800s, they were the wealthiest family in the world, richer than any monarchy. And that wealth came from one source: interest on sovereign debt. They didn't manufacture goods. They didn't build industries. They lent money to governments and collected payments forever. The machine Paterson invented in 1694, Rothschild industrialized and globalized by 1820, and every government in Europe was caught inside it. By 1900, the United States was rapidly becoming the world's largest economy. But its financial system was fragmented and unstable. Banks operated independently. Money supply was rigidly tied to gold. There was no central mechanism to manage liquidity or coordinate lending, and there was no institutional buyer for government debt at scale. J.P. Morgan fixed that, not to help the public, to protect his empire. In 1907, a financial panic struck. Stock prices collapsed, depositors rushed to withdraw money, the economy seized, and J.P. Morgan, at age 70, personally organized a bailout. He gathered the most powerful New York bankers in his private library, locked the doors, and forced them to pledge their own funds to stabilize failing institutions. It worked. The panic subsided. Morgan became the de facto central banker of the United States, but he was old. He knew he couldn't do it again. So Morgan and his circle, the wealthiest bankers in America, designed a permanent solution. They needed a central bank, a lender of last resort, an institution that could create money to buy government bonds and stabilize the banking system. But there was a problem. Americans despised central banks. The first and second banks of the United States had both been destroyed by populist opposition. The public associated central banking with elite control and currency manipulation. So Morgan's group disguised it. In November 1910, Senator Nelson Aldrich and representatives from the largest banks, including Morgan's associates, traveled in secret to Jekyll Island, Georgia. For 9 days, they drafted the blueprint for what would become the Federal Reserve System. The meeting was secret because they knew public knowledge of bankers designing the national monetary system would trigger outrage. The plan they created was a masterpiece of political engineering. The new institution wouldn't be called a central bank. It would be called the Federal Reserve System. It wouldn't be one entity. It would be 12 regional banks, making it look decentralized. It wouldn't be controlled by Wall Street. It would be overseen by a board of governors appointed by the president. It looked democratic, public, accountable, but the structure ensured banker control. The regional Federal Reserve banks were privately owned by member commercial banks. Those banks elected the boards of the regional feds, and the New York Fed, controlled by the largest Wall Street institutions, held the real power. It conducted open market operations, meaning it could create money and buy government bonds. The Federal Reserve Act passed Congress in December 1913. Most representatives didn't understand what they were voting for. President Woodrow Wilson signed it into law, and immediately, the debt trap expanded. Now the government didn't just borrow from private banks and investors. It could borrow from the Federal Reserve, which could create money out of nothing to buy bonds. This is the third piece of the extraction machine. Before the Federal Reserve, there was a natural limit to government borrowing. Banks only had so much money to lend. Investors only had so much capital. But the Federal Reserve removed that limit. Here's the mechanism. The government issues a bond. The Federal Reserve buys it by creating new money, crediting the government's account. The government spends that money into the economy. And the bond, the debt, sits on the Fed's balance sheet forever, or until it's rolled over into new debt. The interest on that bond is paid by taxpayers. And where does it go? To the Federal Reserve, which then distributes most of it back to the Treasury, but keeps a portion for operations and pays dividends to its member banks. But the key is this: the Federal Reserve creates unlimited demand for government debt. The government never has to worry about finding buyers. The Fed will always purchase bonds if needed. This enables infinite borrowing. It never has to pay off the principal because there's always a buyer. And the interest payments flow continuously from taxpayers to bondholders. Morgan died in 1913, the same year the Federal Reserve was created. But his legacy is the mechanism that allows the United States to carry $36 trillion in debt today. Without the Fed, the market couldn't absorb that much borrowing. But with the Fed as the guaranteed backstop, there's no ceiling. The debt trap became infinite. By the 1970s, the machine was running smoothly in the developed world. Governments borrowed, paid interest, rolled over debt. But developing nations were different. Many had borrowed heavily during the 1960s and 70s to build infrastructure, and many were struggling to keep up with payments. The trap was reaching a breaking point, until Paul Volcker made it permanent and global. Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1979. The United States was suffering from double-digit inflation. Confidence in the dollar was eroding. Foreign central banks were losing faith. He needed to crush inflation even if it meant triggering a severe recession. So Volcker raised interest rates to unprecedented levels. The federal funds rate went from 11% to over 20%, the highest in American history. It worked. Inflation fell. But it had another consequence. Developing nations had borrowed billions of dollars during the 1970s when interest rates were low. Much of that debt had floating interest rates tied to US rates. When Volcker raised rates, the cost of servicing that debt tripled. Mexico owed $80 billion. Brazil owed $60 billion. Argentina owed $40 billion. And suddenly, the interest payments alone exceeded their export earnings. They couldn't pay. In August 1982, Mexico announced it could not make its debt payments. Default. Brazil and Argentina were on the verge of the same. This should have triggered a catastrophic collapse. American banks had lent most of that money. Citibank, Bank of America, Chase Manhattan. If Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina defaulted, those banks would take losses so large that some might fail. The entire banking system was at risk. Volcker could have let it happen. Let the banks take losses. Let the market clear. Let bad loans be written off. But he didn't. Instead, he orchestrated a bailout through the International Monetary Fund. The IMF, backed by the US Treasury and the Federal Reserve, would lend Mexico, Brazil, and others enough money to keep making interest payments to American banks. These were called structural adjustment loans, and they came with brutal conditions. Governments had to slash public spending, privatize state-owned companies, open their markets to foreign corporations, devalue their currencies, and submit to external oversight of their economic policies. Essentially, they had to dismantle economic sovereignty in exchange for the money to keep paying interest. The IMF loans didn't reduce the debt. They just restructured it, rolled it over, made it temporarily manageable, but ultimately permanent. This is the fourth piece of the machine. When debt becomes unpayable, don't forgive it. Don't let it default. Restructure it. Lend just enough to keep the interest payments flowing, and extract political and economic concessions in exchange. The debt trap became a tool of geopolitical control. Countries that couldn't pay were forced to open their economies, sell their assets, and surrender policy autonomy in exchange for staying in debt. Volcker's innovation ensured that the machine could never be shut down. Even when countries reached the breaking point, they weren't allowed to exit. They were refinanced and kept inside the system. This pattern has repeated for 40 years. Greece in 2010, Argentina in 2001 and again in 2018, Sri Lanka in 2022. Every time, the same structure. IMF or international creditors step in. Loans are issued to keep interest payments flowing. Austerity is imposed. Sovereignty is surrendered. And the debt is never eliminated, just restructured and extended. Volcker died in 2019. But his legacy is the mechanism that made the debt trap global and inescapable. Now, no nation can default without triggering coordinated international intervention to keep it paying. And the interest continues flowing upward to the same banks, the same funds, the same institutions that hold the bonds. Now let me show you how all four pieces fit together to create the machine that runs today. Start with Patterson's design. Government borrows and pays interest forever. The principal is never repaid. The debt is permanent. Add Rothschild's innovation. The debt is tradable globally. It's owned by a web of interconnected institutions. Default doesn't just hurt one lender. It collapses the entire network. Add Morgan's mechanism. A central bank creates money to buy government bonds. Unlimited demand. The government can always borrow more. There's always a buyer. Add Volcker's trap. When nations can't pay, restructure the debt. Keep them inside the system. Extract concessions. Never let them escape. The result is the system we live in today. The United States government owes over $36 trillion. Japan owes nearly $10 trillion. The United Kingdom, Germany, France, Italy, all carrying debts larger than their annual economies. Globally, total debt, public and private, exceeds $300 trillion, 3 times global GDP, and none of it will ever be repaid. Here's the mechanism in detail. The US Treasury issues bonds to cover the gap between tax revenue and spending. Who buys them? About half are purchased by domestic institutions, pension funds, insurance companies, mutual funds, banks. Another portion is bought by foreign governments, mostly China and Japan. and a significant portion is bought by the Federal Reserve itself using newly created money. Those bonds pay interest. Currently, the US government pays roughly $900 billion per year in interest on the debt. That's more than the defense budget. That interest comes from taxes, income tax, payroll tax, corporate tax. You work, you earn, the government takes a cut and sends it to bondholders. Who are the bondholders? Mostly large financial institutions. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity. These firms manage tens of trillions in assets. They buy government bonds with money from pension funds, retirement accounts, insurance premiums, and they collect the interest. So here's the flow. You pay taxes. The government sends that money as interest to bondholders. The bondholders are institutions controlled by financial elites. It's a direct transfer from labor to capital, continuous, automatic, and nearly invisible. And it's not just the United States. Every developed nation runs the same system. In Japan, the central bank owns nearly half of all government bonds. In Europe, the European Central Bank buys bonds from member states. Everywhere, the structure is identical. Government borrows perpetually. Central banks create money to buy the debt. Interest is paid from taxes. And the debt never decreases. It only grows. Here's why escape is impossible. If the United States paid off its debt, if it somehow ran surpluses and redeemed every bond, the money supply would collapse. Because dollars are created when the government borrows. When the Fed buys a treasury bond, it creates new money. That money circulates in the economy. If the debt were paid off, those dollars would be destroyed. The result would be severe deflation, economic collapse, mass unemployment. So the government cannot pay off the debt. The system requires permanent borrowing. The debt must grow or the currency fails. And this is true globally. If every government paid off its debt, the global money supply would shrink by 2/3. International trade would cease. The financial system would collapse. So the debt is structural. It's necessary by design. It can never be eliminated. And the interest payments, funded by your taxes, flow continuously to the institutions that own the bonds. Now add inflation. Inflation is the silent partner of the debt machine. When the government and central banks create new money to buy bonds, that money enters circulation. More money chasing the same goods means prices rise. Your wages might increase slightly, but not as fast as prices. The purchasing power of your savings erodes. Inflation is a hidden tax. It transfers wealth from savers to debtors. And the biggest debtor is the government. Inflation lets the government repay debt with money that's worth less than when it borrowed. But you, the taxpayer and saver, lose purchasing power. Every year, your savings buy less. Every year, the cost of housing, food, energy rises faster than your income. That's not accidental. It's the machine working. Inflation reduces the real cost of debt for the government while quietly taxing your savings. Then add interest rates. When you borrow money for a house, a car, education, you pay interest. That interest flows to banks. And banks use deposits and borrowed funds to make those loans. But where do banks get cheap funding? From the Federal Reserve. The Fed lends to banks at low rates. Banks lend to you at higher rates. They capture the spread. And if banks get into trouble, the Fed bails them out, as it did in 2008 and 2020, by creating money and buying assets. So you pay interest on your debts. The government pays interest on its debt. And both streams of interest flow upward to financial institutions. The machine extracts from both sides. From your labor through taxes, and from your borrowing through interest. Now combine it all. You work and earn income. The government takes income tax and payroll tax. It uses that to pay interest on its debt. You spend what's left. Sales tax, property tax. What you save loses value to inflation. If you borrow, you pay interest to banks. Every mechanism pulls value away from you and channels it upward. And the system is designed so you can never get ahead. If wages rise, inflation rises. If you save, inflation erodes it. If you borrow, interest extracts it. If you pay taxes, it funds debt service. The machine runs automatically, and it was built this way. Here's who benefits. The top 1% owns more than half of all financial assets. Stocks, bonds, real estate. The wealthiest 10% owns about 90%. They own the bonds that pay interest funded by your taxes. They own the assets that appreciate when central banks create money. They own the corporations that benefit from government spending funded by debt. When the government borrows $1 trillion and spends it, That money flows into the economy. But it doesn't flow evenly. It goes to contractors, corporations, financial institutions. They receive it first, when it still has full purchasing power. By the time it reaches you, through wages or services, inflation has already started eroding it. This is called the Cantillon effect. Those closest to the source of new money benefit most. Those furthest away are harmed. And guess who's closest? Banks, bondholders, financial elites. Guess who's furthest? Workers, savers, ordinary citizens. The machine is designed to transfer wealth upward continuously and automatically, not through conspiracy, but through structure. The four architects didn't coordinate across centuries, but each solved a problem in a way that benefited creditors, and each piece built on the last. Paterson made debt permanent. Rothschild made it global and interconnected. Morgan made it infinite through central banking. Volcker made it inescapable even for nations that couldn't pay. Together, they built a system where you are locked into perpetual payment. You work, you're taxed, and that funds interest on debt that will never be repaid. You save, inflation erodes it. You borrow, you pay interest. Every mechanism extracts, and the machine runs, whether you understand it or not. Now here's what this means for you. First, recognize that the system isn't broken. It's functioning exactly as designed. The debt will never be paid off. It's not supposed to be. The goal isn't fiscal responsibility. The goal is perpetual extraction, interest payments flowing upward forever. Second, understand that inflation is not a mistake or a policy failure. It's a feature. It's how the government reduces the real burden of debt while quietly taxing your savings. Every year, your money buys less. That's the machine working. Third, realize that you are not a citizen being served by your government. You are a resource being harvested. Your labor is taxed. Your savings are devalued. Your borrowing generates interest. All of it flows upward. The machine runs on your productivity. And you can't vote your way out, because both parties in every country rely on the same system. They borrow, they spend, they pay interest. Changing leaders doesn't change the structure. Fourth, know that the system will continue until it can't. Debt can grow infinitely as long as confidence holds. As long as people believe the government will pay interest, even if it never repays principal, the machine runs. But confidence is not infinite. When enough people lose faith, when bond markets refuse to buy, when inflation spirals, the machine seizes. That's when the real crisis comes. Not because debt is high, but because the extraction system breaks down. So what do? You can't stop the machine, but you can stop being unaware of it. Understand that wealth stored in currency is being slowly confiscated through inflation. Understand that government debt is not your nation's problem to solve. It's the bondholder's income stream, funded by your taxes. Understand that the financial system is designed to keep you in debt, keep you working, keep you paying. The machine needs you to stay inside it. Start recognizing the mechanisms. Know that it means future interest payments, funded by taxes. Every time you hear about central bank intervention, know that it means new money creation, which means inflation, which means your savings lose value. Every time you hear about a nation restructuring debt, know that it means they're being forced to stay inside the system, keep paying, and surrender sovereignty. The machine is everywhere. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you understand it, you stop blaming individuals and start seeing structure. This isn't about corrupt politicians or greedy bankers, though those exist. It's about a system built over centuries to extract wealth continuously from the many and concentrate it in the hands of the few. 4 architects, 4 innovations, 1 machine, and it's running right now. On you. If this changed how you see taxes, inflation, and debt, if you finally understand that you're not struggling because you're not working hard enough, but because the system is designed to extract from you continuously, then you're beginning to see how power actually operates. Subscribe if you want to keep tracking these mechanisms, because they're not taught in schools, they're not discussed in media, and the people who benefit from them would prefer you never understand how it works. The machine runs best when it's invisible. Now you see it, and you can't look away.